where this all happened. Shia protesters were headed to the city's Palace of Justice, calling for the removal of that judge leading the investigation into the port blast. The army says crowds came under fire at Tayuna traffic circle here. Chaos then broke out with rockets and intense gunfire for more than 4 hours, almost 5 hours, as Zaina was reporting there. It all happened right on the site of a decades-old sectarian fault line. The so-called Green Line separated Muslim and Christian factions during Lebanon's 15-year-long civil war, which ended as recently as 1990. But divisions there are still deeply entrenched. On the west is Chia, predominantly home to Shia Muslims and the Hezbollah and Amal political groups. And on the east is Ain al-Ramani, a long-time stronghold of the Christian Lebanese Forces political movement. And on Thursday, the army was once again between them, trying to bring the violence under control. Joining us here in the studio, Rami Khouri, Director of Global Engagement at the American University of Beirut. Rami Khouri, welcome back to the News Hour.
Nice to be in Doha again.
Thank you. What really happened today?
What happened today was another manifestation of an underlying structural weakness in Lebanon as a country, which has manifested itself over and over since the 1950s, really. And they've never worked out a governance system except one where the sectarian leaders each take a share of power, allocated by seats in parliament or ministries. The seats in parliament are elected, but the election law and the electoral system is gerrymandered by these same groups to come up with predictable outcomes, usually. And then they share the different ministries and senior positions in the army and diplomatic corps and all that. So this system has functioned more or less okay for many years. But after the Syrians ran Lebanon for 30 years and then the Syrians left, the system became totally corrupted and mismanaged, pretty uncaring, and uncaring about the well-being of ordinary Lebanese. And this has been clearly seen. I've lived through the last 17 years in Lebanon. Things deteriorated slowly, slowly, slowly. The water, the electricity, the school system, various essential, the energy, the electricity, various essentials of life started to deteriorate, and people had to pay extra money for all of these things, which created huge pressures on people's home life. And this was all the result of a political system that cared only about maintaining its incumbency for the different groups and didn't really care about how the people suffered. And when tensions rise, when there's fear that you might lose some of your seats in parliament, then people take to the street. The sectarian leaders and their armed groups take to the streets. And the equation in Lebanon for many years now has been people threaten civil strife or their demands are met. So it's a terrible situation. It's a system that doesn't serve the people anymore. The majority of Lebanese want it changed, reformed, but the majority are helpless. We know that from polling and other evidence that a majority of Lebanese want to reform the system according to what the street protesters for 2 years have been asking.
Even by the standards of Lebanon, snipers allegedly deliberately firing at people's heads, that's a new low when it comes to violence on the streets.
Well,
who do you think is behind the snipers?
Well, first of all, it's not totally a new low. People have been killing each other, assassinating each other, blowing them up with the car bombs. And so there's been terrible atrocities, people going into churches and killing political leaders in the church. So the evidence suggests that it's forces who are against Hezbollah and Amal, who don't want the investigation stopped, and Hezbollah and Amal are trying to get and others are trying to get the investigation stopped. So there's various forces that you can identify. The Lebanese forces have been singled out as one possibility, but we don't actually know until we have evidence. But it doesn't matter in every incident who it is, because there's always 2 or 3 options of people who might do this. And the trouble is that some of these people could be instigated by outside forces, or people within the country pay somebody off to do this. It's a terrible political situation where violence has become the currency of political transactions.
In the middle of all this, there's what we believe to be, clearly, a fine, upstanding judge who just wants to do his job. He just wants to run the inquiry into what happened in the port more than a year ago now. Is he safe?
Oh, I think he's in terrible danger, personally. I mean, somebody like him doing what he's doing, and he's issuing arrest warrants, he's issuing orders to have senior people come to be questioned, including former army and police senior officials, former prime ministers, members of parliament. He's challenging the oligarchic elite in a way that it's never been challenged before. External powers, the United States, France, others have tried to do this. They couldn't. But suddenly this guy appears from within the system, and a judge, he's young, he's around 47, I think, not very well known. He's not well known because he's never played a political role, and he decides that he really has to do his job as a judge. And I think he is in danger, but hopefully he's well protected.
Knock forward for me the point that Zaina Hodder was making during our conversation at the top of the programme. What if the 4.5, 5 hours of gun battles on the streets today was a very short prologue or an opening chapter into the continued slip or slide down the way? Because you're framing this in terms of a 17-year narrative where everything is going into the negative, and to which incidents during those 17 years, the politicians have clearly either underreacted or not reacted, or they've done that thing that Lebanese politicians always, it seems to me, seem to do. They go quiet for a couple of months, and then they come back and they say, oh, we'll sort it, we'll fix it. But then nothing, it feels like nothing ever changes.
Well, all of those points are essentially correct. But the reality in Lebanon, as I've experienced it for many years, I've been living there on and off from the 1970s till today. I just moved a year ago. But the reality is that the evolution of the political system depends a lot on the individual personalities, who's president, who's heading each party. And sometimes they will use violence, sometimes they will just use violence as a kind of signal. So some people say that this is just a signal today, a warning shot from both sides, from Hezbollah and Amal and from the people against them, presumably some Christian forces, but it could be somebody else. And saying, look, if this investigation keeps going, we're going to take to the streets with our guns. And the other side is saying, we're going to take to the streets with our guns if you keep preventing the investigation. It's a very difficult situation because the last thing that Lebanese people want is a resumption of large-scale domestic fighting. They went through the civil war. I was there when it happened. It was a terrible thing. Nobody wants another civil. No country goes through 2 civil wars. Usually you go through 1 civil war and then something happens.
Because somebody's won.
Because somebody's won, or they reach an agreement. And but the Lebanese situation is very bizarre because there has never been a clear consensus about the political culture. It worked reasonably well in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and then into the 70s, and then the civil war started, the Syrians took over for 30 years. And then after the Syrians left, the problem was Lebanon always had an external kind of, not patron, but some external power that looked after it. It could have been the French at some point, the Saudis at some point, the Americans at some point, the Iranians were involved. There was always external forces that helped Lebanon get through certain crises. That doesn't really exist now. And after the Syrians left, having run the country for 30 years, they were thrown out by popular protests. The system was totally open and chaotic, and corruption went through the roof. Services declined. And people could do nothing about it. When the uprising started 2 years ago, over 2 years ago, it was actually 2 years ago in October, the same thing happened in Lebanon as happened in Algeria, Iraq, and Sudan, and other countries where major protests went on for years and years. The ruling elite ignored the protests, offered symbolic but meaningless limited reforms, like have an early election like they did in Algeria. They just did one in Iraq. These are not serious reforms. Or they threatened the protesters with gunfire, beating them up, putting them in jail, threatening them with indictments to go to court, to intimidate them. And this is what these ruling oligarchic elites do. This is how they stay in power. They've been in power, some of them 30, 40, 50 years. They've controlled the money and the guns in the country. They have immense linkages through networks of allies and cronies and subordinates and people that live off them. They have thousands and thousands of people who will fight to keep the system in place. And this is exactly what you're seeing. So in Lebanon, Hezbollah is the strongest single party, and it's allied with Amal and a few others. The opposition forces, Christian and others, are not as strong as Hezbollah, but they don't want Hezbollah to dictate everything. And so what you're seeing today are small, limited cases of people saying, look, we're not going to just roll over and die. We'll fight. If we have to fight, we'll fight. But fighting isn't going to solve anything. So it's really a terrible dilemma for the whole country. They can't recreate a new system that everybody agrees on. They don't want to go back to the old system. Meanwhile, the masses of Lebanese are suffering terribly without electricity, gasoline, etc., and not knowing, can your kids go to school today? So it's really, the problem is that of a state that doesn't work as a state. It did for many years, but it doesn't now.
OK. Rami, we'll have to leave it there. Many thanks. Rami Khouri from the American University of Beirut. Great to have you here in Doha as well. Thank you so much.